I'm John Clark, and I'm here on Lathrop Street in the home of Frank Wickham. And Frank, would you spell your name for me?
Yeah, it's Wickham.
And tell me a little bit about your background, where you're from, how you came to be here, and that sort of thing.
I was born in Newark, Ohio, and my family settled in Licking County in 1804 on the Wickham side of the family. When I left there to go to college at Ohio Northern University, and then eventually ended up in Atlanta, Georgia before I came here. I was in school at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And I came here in 1968 because I heard there was a job available at the State Board of Pharmacy. And so I took it, and I applied, and I was given the position, and eventually I became executive director of the Board of Pharmacy. And I served them for I was the board for 30 years, essentially. Started under Governor Rhodes and clear through I can't remember the last governor right offhand now, but many, many governors. It was quite a career. Had a master's degree in pharmacology. I was working on my PhD when I decided that wasn't worthwhile getting, and so I left Emory University to come to Columbus and look for a job. And I was 31, and I wanted to get married. I wanted a family. And so my wife doesn't like me always to tell this story, but anyhow, I saw when I moved down in the village. As soon as I came back, I moved so I could walk to work. And I would walk to work for 30-some years because I went from the village over to here. I was in the Schmidhoff apartments at that time. Now they're condos right there near Schmidt's, and had a small apartment there. Met my wife through a computer program, one of the first computer programs. There was a 8.5 by 14 piece of paper tacked to a telephone pole with saying computer dates, and you tear off the telephone number, call them, and they send you an application, and I think it was $4. You got 5 women's names and telephone numbers.
What year was this, Frank?
This was back in '68.
Computer dating in 1968.
Yeah, '68. One of the very primitive ones, at this
That's
point.
Great.
Not very sophisticated. She was third on the list, and so I met her. I think she was studying nursing in Ohio State. We got married. I got engaged at a little restaurant that's no longer there. It was on, let's see here, City Park, almost near Livingston. I can't think of the name of it now. But it was
Bavarian House, maybe?
Bavarian House, I think it was. I remember it was in the basement with where we were having dinner, and I asked her to marry me, and she agreed to. And so she's from Cleveland, Ohio. And we were married in June of that following June, June the 6th of 1970. Lived in the apartment for a while, and then that year we decided we needed to get something, buy a house, and we found this place and moved in at Thanksgiving of 1970. And fixed it up. It was we're the 5th family to live here. Matter of fact, one of the girl who grew up here. I got a book here with all kinds of pictures and information about her mother who lived here, and with her uncle. His wife apparently died. He was a stonemason. He had his, and so historically he had his stone yard over on Beach and Sycamore. And he was quite a legend. He rode a white horse. He had a black patch because he had lost his nose, but a horse kicked him and cancer, I guess. But he rode around the village, and he did all these. If you look at our house, the lentils over the front are his. That's the design that he did. He did something fancy, essentially, but he built this house, did all the stonework. Much of the stonework is out in front, his, as far as the wall's concerned. And if you look in the backyard, he did all these sculptures and such, which is an interesting story because his niece took and went down, appeared a couple of years ago down at German Village Society. He says, "I've got all these stone sculptures by this stonemason who was my uncle, and I like to sell them or give them to somebody." And they said, "Well, you go down and see Frank Wickham because we think he lives at that house that you're talking about." And so they did, and they gave them to me. We brought them back from Fairfax, Virginia, where she had them. And we're going to put them back in the backyard here in the very near future. But they're over 100, 1884 is when they were carved, essentially.
Do you think they were here at one time, or had he carved them
No,
to go else?
He had them here. They were all done here. And matter of fact, he died here and on this property. Apparently his wife had died, and then his niece moved in with him, and her name was Husser, and she graduated from St. Mary's. And this is all documented. We got pictures of the house. They brought pictures of even the furniture, where it was placed, and what kind of furniture was in it. And so it's a very interesting
I'll
book.
definitely want to see that.
You want to look at
what
that.
was his name? Do you recall?
His name was Sauter, S-A-U-T-E-R, John Sauter.
With a T.
With a T, S-A-U-T-E-R. Yeah, there's not too many around now, but that spelling, whether they dropped a T out or not, we don't know. But it was an interesting story. We don't know why, but he eventually committed suicide. And out here in the backyard, they had 2 little sheds along here. If you go back to the old insurance company, maps and such, Sanborn maps, you'll see 2 buildings back there, and that's where he kept the horses. And he disappeared one night, and they found him out there dead in the backyard, in one of those sheds. But so there's quite a history here. I keep thinking I see somebody every sometimes, like a ghost, but I'm not sure. Wandering around the grounds and such here. But when we moved in here, it was a very different community. We were beginning to gentrify the community. At that time, probably the most wealthy individuals in the neighborhood, even though I was only making $11,000 a year with the state. But our neighbors didn't really appreciate us. Our front porch got egged from time to time, garbage and such.
Why did they not care for you?
Well, we were representing a change, and we're driving them out and gentrifying the neighborhood and such, and they didn't care for that,
And so they vandalized?
So they vandalized and such, but it stopped after a while, and then they eventually moved away, and of course the place continued to develop and that type of thing. A lot of interesting stories about the area, I can tell you, but it's been a fascinating life here. We raised 7 children here. They've all gone to St. Mary's. They're now scattered all over. Very successful. I wanted them to grow up in the inner city, and that's one of the reasons I came down to German Village. I wanted them to know that if they're out riding their bike and they see 2 guys coming along with a bike and somebody's riding on the handlebars, they're looking for another bike. And you better avoid them, and that type of thing. So they became street smart. And so they've all done very well, and we're really pleased. All of them have gone to college except for one, and he is he works for the federal government in sheriff's office now. He's a sheriff's deputy on the bomb squad. And so we had paper routes. That was another nice feature because they were able to work. We one time had about 4 paper routes we were carrying at the same time. My youngest daughter, she carried the paper on 3rd Street. I remember delivering many of the papers down there where the House for Haven is, and Howard and Fred were down there, So we got to know them, and then we moved over to 5th Street, I think, and then Ebner Street, and then around here. But all 7 children, they were able to carry papers. They all had about $10,000 in CDs when they graduated, and they had a scholarship from the Dispatch, and so they were set for college. It was just it's been a good experience.
Now, you were living in the Schmidthof, you said, next to Schmidt's Sausage House.
Right.
And that, of course, is where the old sausage plant was.
Right.
But you said they were apartments at first and now they're condos?
Yeah, they were apartments at first. Yeah, inexpensive apartments. They were... people claimed that you could hear the pig squeal in the basement, though, at night. I don't remember that I ever heard that. But, it was nice apartments at that point in time. And you had indoor parking for $5 or something like a month, It was very, very, very inexpensive. And so then we bought over here. This house needed a lot of work. It had a young man had moved in on it and had taken a lot of the plaster off the brick walls and everything. And when they sandblasted the house, they blew holes in the plaster on the inside. They put too much pressure and that type of thing. So I don't think they had much experience at that time with doing the houses and such. So that's where we've been. And then we've added on to the house 3 times. And we had 5 foster children we had raised here too. Some of them very temporarily though, beside our 7. And so I just love the place. I love St. Mary's. I fell in love with it immediately, and after I converted to Catholicism. And to me, I love the history. I'm a history buff, and I wasn't until I started doing genealogy. I hated history in high school. And once I started doing genealogy, then I became very, very interested in knowing as much as I could about history.
You were telling me off camera a little bit about your conversion. Would you relate that story again, please?
Yeah, well, my conversion came about with my boss, who was the executive director of the Board of Pharmacy, who was originally a pharmacist in Cincinnati. He owned several pharmacies down there, was on the Board of Pharmacy, and then when they had a vacancy, he was hired as the executive director. He was from Cincinnati. Him and his wife had one child who happened to be the same age as I was, but he was Down syndrome. And as I got to know him, his family stayed in Cincinnati, and he stayed up here in an apartment when he worked in Columbus during the week. And I was impressed by their faith and how they dealt with this child. The story I was told was that, first of all, they were older when they had the child, and they took and went to the doctor, and they said Down syndrome, and they wouldn't accept that. And they traveled all over the United States trying to get somebody else to say something different. Didn't come back home, and the doctor that they went to originally said, you've got two things you can do. You can put him in an institution, forget about him, or you can take him home and love him, and thank God you're going to have a child for the rest of your life, and he'll be with you for the rest of their life, and that's what they did. And then they developed all kinds of programs for the Down syndrome children in Cincinnati, where they could go to celebrate the sacraments of the church, take communion and that type of thing. Got the Catholic high schools, or the high schools in the area, involved with them, where they would put on, they'd conduct dances for them, take them bowling. They had once a week and those types of things. So it was just a good experience, and it was he was such a loving person. You really get to know a Down syndrome person is just phenomenal. The story I always like to tell is that people would come to visit them, and they had taught him how to use a camera. So every time somebody come to visit, he'd always take a picture of you, put it in his album, and he'd date it. And then sometimes he'd take, and then certain times of the year he'd send them a card, maybe on the anniversary of when he first met them, or their birthday or some special occasion. And if they never responded, he'd always call them and want to know what did he do to offend them, and type of thing. Just a good example of the love that they really they experience, and that they exude as far as they're concerned. So I talked to them, Mr. Kunkel was his name, and I said, I'd like to become a Catholic. And he said, I know how I'll get you involved with some priests down at the cathedral. So I did. So I started instructions and became a Catholic, having been a Southern Baptist prior to that.
Now, were you married at the time?
No, I was not.
Before
I got married. And of course, married a woman who's a big cradle Catholic, and she's from a very Catholic family from Cleveland, Ohio, Hungarian and Bohemian.
You said cradle Catholic, somebody's been born a Catholic, right? Okay, I never had heard that term.
I haven't heard that term, yeah, right from the beginning, a cradle Catholic. And so, and a wonderful woman, and it's amazing. She wanted children too, and I'll never forget that she was staying with two other students studying nursing in Ohio State up on 9th Avenue. It's a parking garage now, but it was a house. They lived in the attic. There was 3 bedrooms up there, I guess, and a kitchen and such, a little dining room. And I'll never forget, when I went up to visit her first time, I pulled up, and one of the women who was there, she was married, her husband was in Vietnam at the time, and she said, he's a family man. He's in a station wagon. And she was known as the Pied Piper of children. That when she was in Cleveland, she was one who always gathered up several children and take them anywhere to all kinds of events and everything. She loved children, and she just proved to be a wonderful mother. Our kids have done well because of her in many respects, because I spent a lot of time traveling and everything. Very successful career at the pharmacy, and executive director. I eventually became president of the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, and then I traveled quite a bit with them. And then, of course, when I retired in 1998, and And then started my own consulting business, and I consulted with the healthcare industry, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Were you ever a pharmacist or a retail pharmacist?
I would practice pharmacy for about 1 year, which was interesting. I took and I graduated in 1960. It was a 4-year program. My dad was a grocer, a very practical man, and he graduated from high school. My mother didn't. And of course, I was born during 38s and the bad years. Essentially, things were rough for them. But he eventually became a grocery owner, and he came to me one day and said, "I know what you should do." I worked with him from a little kid on up, because when I'd get up in the morning, he'd make me carry the pop bottles and the beer bottles and such. You kept them, returned them to the brewery and such, and that type of thing. And then I eventually learned how to take and cut meat, butcher, and such, and work in the grocery store. But I became a senior. I didn't know what a pharmacy was. And my dad came to me and he says, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know what I want to do." He said, "I know what you're going to do. You're going to be a pharmacist. And you're going to go to High Northern University," which I thought was fascinating. And I'd never heard of High Northern University. Never been in a pharmacy in my life. And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I don't want you going to any of the other schools because they're 5 years and High Northern's 4. There's no sense of spending an extra year getting the same degree." And so I did, went and got my degree, and then graduated and got a job in Mansfield, Ohio as a pharmacist. And I worked up there for about 1.5 years. And I got a call from a friend who had a relative who worked on the draft board, and they said, "You're going to be drafted probably in a couple of weeks, so if you want to do something else, you better do something about it, And so I went to my boss and I said, if you can get me into, I knew there was a medic unit nearby, and if you can get me into a medic unit in the reserves, I'd appreciate it, and I'd work for you for 1 year after I got out. And so he did, and he was a major in the reserves too. So I ended up going to being a medic. Then I had friends that I graduated with from High Northern who had moved to Idaho, and they said, "Come out to Idaho. We think you'd like it out here." So I did, because in Mansfield I learned to ski on that snow trails. It was about a 50-foot rope tow up the hill. Yeah. A lot of ice, Now it's not much different. So I did, and went out there, and I never forget, I lived in a basement apartment near the Nazarene College in Napa, Idaho, and I think I had a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a credit card in a car, and no job.
What year was this, Frank?
That was in 1962, right around 1962.
You had a credit card, though. That was quite something.
Yeah, I had a credit card, yeah, and I don't know how I had that, but I did. And so I took into after that, I went out and started looking for jobs. And Idaho, of course, is a small state at that time. I think 500,000 people at the most, and a lot of independent pharmacies, one pharmacist. And so I go to small towns. The pharmacists out there like to go to Nevada to gamble, or they like to go hunting, for whatever. And so I'd come in and run the store for them, and home sit for them, house sit for them at the same time. And it was a fantastic experience. They're such a trusting and wonderful people. They'd have one of the clerks meet me at the door with a key and a blank check, and I was told to write my check out before I left. What it was signed and everything, what they owed me, and so I did that for about 2 years before I went back to school. I went back to school in Pocatello, Idaho. I wanted to get my master's degree in pharmacy, so I did, but it fell through. I hadn't been a very good student at Ohio Northern University. I was a social fraternity, and I was social chairman, in charge of a lot of parties. So education wasn't really my forte. So they said, "Well, you've got to do all these things in order to get a master's degree." So I started doing them, and I got into the master's program and did well. And also while working in the area as a pharmacist on a part-time basis. And eventually they had a one-man pharmacology department, which was what I was studying, and he left. And he said, "I'll take you with me. And if you want to go with me, I'm going to Arkansas." That was his home. we went down there, and I didn't like it, and so we got into University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, and the pharmacy school there, and then I got my master's in 1966 from there. Mm-hmm. And then my major professor talked me into going to Emory University because the director of the pharmacology department there, he was an MD who was very well known, and in the industry, in pharmacology, especially as far as the heart's concerned, cardiology and such. And so I went there for a while, but it didn't work out. And so I was 31. It looked like it was going to be several more years to get a degree. And I said, you know, I've got a life. I've got other things I want to do in my life. So I quit, and that's when I came to Columbus and found this job at the state of Ohio, and then was with it for 30 years.
And that's about the time you met your wife.
I came here in '68. Yeah, about 2 years later. Yeah, met my wife through this. I tried everything else that you don't meet a woman. You go to the different clubs, ski clubs and such, and the bars and everything. It didn't work out.
Wasn't for you.
It wasn't for me. It wasn't for me.
So,
go ahead. Well, I said I always tell the story too. You know, I had 5 names, and first 2 didn't work out. They were bad experiences, but the 3rd one worked out. But I still have the other 2 names.
Do you?
The telephone numbers probably aren't any good. I just tell my wife that all the time.
So the 3rd one, which was your wife, was that the only one you ever called?
Yes, that was the last one I called. Right? Yeah, that was the last one I called, and then I wouldn't let go of her. So I was 31, and she was about. Let's see, she's born in 42. So,
what year were you born, Frank?
38.
1938.
Yeah, 1938. Yeah, October the 12th. So just recently my birthday. But so that was our experience, and we've had a wonderful life since then. And we have had 7 children I told you about, and now we have I think it's 17 grandchildren. I think.
Wow.
I might have lost count. I might have to check and see, count them up later on. But then all of them are in Columbus except for 2, and they're down in Williamsburg, Virginia. My daughter, number 3, was an interesting story. My daughter Ann came to me between her junior and senior year at Bishop Hartley High School and said, "Dad, I'd like to go to West Point." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting, you know. West Point, you have to do certain things. It requires a congressional appointment." So I said, "These are the things you got to do." Well, she had babysit for Greg Lashutka, so Lashutkas knew her well. Bob Bennett, head of the Republican Party, was one of her paper customers 2 streets over. And so when she talked, I said, "Talk to Greg Lashutka and such," and so she did. And he says, "Well, talk to Debbie Price. She was the congresswoman at that time. She has appointments." And I think she's one of the only women to apply that year, and there was quite a few applicants. I'm not sure whether she's the only one or not, but anyhow, she applied, and they helped her out. Greg had put together a committee to take and prepare her for the interview for the appointment. She got the appointment and went to West Point with her mother, and she didn't like it. When she got there, her mother loved it because it was old and everything, and she didn't like it. And Deborah had told her to go over to Kings Point, and so Merchant Marines. And so she went over there and she loved it. And so she got her degree from Kings Point. And at Kings Point, what's interesting, it's Merchant Marine Academy, and you have your choice of the different services you want to go into. And so she chose the Coast Guard, and about a month ago she was made commander, and she's now commander at Yorktown, Yorktown, Virginia. And
so she has loved it all these years?
So she's loved it all these years. She'll probably retire. I tried to talk her into going for admiral. I thought it would be neat to have an admiral in the family, but she's not interested. She wants to retire. So she wants to take and enjoy her children and everything. She 2 beautiful twins, a boy and a girl.
Very nice.
And such. So my wife's down there visiting now with her, and we go down quite often. The rest of the grandchildren are around here, though, and
well, you had said that being a historian with St. Mary's Church is pretty much a full-time job for you now, even though it's volunteer. What have you learned about St. Mary's over the years? I know there's a very rich history there, but I don't know how many people have actually work to preserve that history?
Well, not much was done recently. The first thing that was done was he was one of the founding members of the German Village Society, Bill Lanke. Mm-hmm. And when he joined the church, and he had decided to take and put together an alumni list. And so because St. Mary's had never documented it and had an alumni mailing list, and this is it's a very important aspect of this church. And it's for the high school. So this is St. Mary's High School, even though I don't think he went there. But anyhow, so he started the list, and then they just started a little museum. And they started collecting artifacts and such from the history and such, starting to pull things together. And Nancy Plank, Kelly, she's one of the Planks now, married to Don Kelly, the developer. She donated money to convert one of the rooms in the Spec Center to a museum, and that's what we have now. We more or less calling it the archives now. Mm-hmm. And so that I took and been very involved with the school. I've been on the finance committee at the parish ever since '68. I've also taken and not only the finance committee, but parish councils, probably all different types of work. St. Vincent de Paul I've been very involved with ever since I joined the church. And then when we started having trouble keeping the school open from the standpoint of money, and tuition kept getting higher, it was harder and harder for the families to take and send their kids there. But soon realized that we needed to raise money on a regular basis, an annual basis, to take and close the gap. St. Mary's Parish is very unique. It's never been rich, and we still are a rich parish. The building was built by dimes and nickels, such. They used to. All the members of the church used to have to save their dime a day. Mm-hmm. And then turn it in every month, each family, and even the children had to do that. Mm. And so that's how they did a lot. And they built the church for $40,000. And then today, to repair it, we don't even know how much yet. We're still trying to figure out what it's really going to cost to repair it. And we're hoping to have those figures in the very near future. But I started getting involved. I met with diocesan officials. And I was very upset because I had 2 children enrolled at Worley High School. It was named after Father Worley, the only Catholic high school in the city named after a priest. And a beautiful building, built way down on south of Weems Road. I don't know if you've ever known where it's at or not, but it's now the Fire Academy. That's where the Columbus Fire Academy, that's where they train their firemen and such, one of the places. And we took and my 2 daughters were there when they decided to close the school. There was never enough Catholics in that area to really support it. A lot of non-Catholics were going to school there, and a lot of very poor people were going there. And bingo sustained it for a while. I learned a lot about bingo. I thought bingo was a simple game, until I joined the Catholic Church and had to work bingo. I couldn't believe there's so many different ways to win bingo, And it was something, because that was one of the ways that we really funded Catholic education, supported it.
Did your children go to the elementary school?
Yes, they went to elementary too. And then the 2 girls were at Hartley when they closed, or Bishop Father Worley's high school when they closed it. And I had 2 boys there. And they had the choices to either transfer to Bishop Hartley or to Bishop Reedy. And they preferred, many of their friends were going to Bishop Hartley, and they preferred to go to Bishop Hartley. Mm-hmm. So after those 2 girls graduated, the rest of them graduated from Bishop Hartley High School. And but we tried to keep Worley open, and we weren't successful. We were told that we could keep it open if we could take and raise $1 million in a month. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't possible, of course, but we tried, and we didn't do it. So it was closed. Then I realized I also was involved with collecting tuition down there. There was no good system for collecting tuition, and so I, as president of the parish school board and such, we set up a little committee to collect tuition, because we, the parents, are invested in this. This is our, so we would be able more likely person to talk to people about, you got to pay your tuition, you got to come up with it. It was a wonderful school. The poor kids down there that went to school there amazed me, because they took and they got their grade card. Mom wanted to see it. Dad wanted to see it if Dad was there. Grandma wants to see it. And uncles and aunts want to see it because they're all working bingo trying to keep them in school. You know? And they're all supporting it. So they're all vested in this child's education and such. But it just didn't work out. And so eventually it was sold to the city of Columbus as a fire academy. But then I got involved at Bishop Hartley, and same thing, tuition collection. I got involved with tuition collection, being on the school board. Well, when they closed early, too, the Bishop Griffin appointed me to I was appointed to actually through the priest, to the Bishop's Elementary Planning Committee. And I've been on it now ever since. Well, it's been about 28 years or more now. Mm-hmm. And so I've been very involved. Well, when we got into trouble at St. Mary's, and we're about $200,000 short of making our budget for the school each year, we worked with the development department, and we come up with a Guardian Angel fundraising program. And one of the things that was obvious to me was our parish was so small and such a different type of parish that we had to have the support of the community. So I developed a mailing list. I started making a mailing list of the homes who lives where here in the village, and maintaining it. And we have used that now for the last 5 or 6 years to raise money, about $200,000 to take and cover the shortfall in the school. And so we've kept the school open over the years, but it's been a struggle. And but it's and of course, you know, they closed all the other Southside Catholic schools. You know, we had Corpus Christi, we had St. Leo's, we had St. Ladislas, and those are all closed. And of course, they closed the schools, but then they closed also the Church of St. Leo's. And so we're the last elementary Catholic school. Well, Catholic school on the south side of Columbus. There's no high school down here now, and most of our children have to go to either Reedy or they have to go to Bishop Hartley at this point. But we've had this Guardian Angel program, and that's what we're having to do with essentially the restoration of the church, is having to go to the community. The parish is changing. You know, as I do the history of it, I'm so fascinated because it was such a tight-knit community of immigrants. They were all in the same boat, you know. They didn't have much, and so they really struggled. But they had three things. One of the things that impressed me about the Catholic Church at that time was the first thing they built was a building so they could have classes, school, education, provide education. And so, like the Spec Center, it was eventually the classroom, first classroom. It was the first place where they held Mass until they could get the church built. It's where the priest lived upstairs. And so that's how they did it. And they just really, you know, and it continued to grow. And then, of course, it got so big that they had started a high school, too. And,
before St. Mary's came along, where did most of the Catholics down here in this end of town go to church?
Essentially, they all belong to what's now Holy Cross, but it was called St. Regimius originally, but that's the first Catholic church in German up there. There was two Catholic churches here, the Irish, St. Pat's, and essentially the Germans at Holy Cross.
And where is Holy Cross?
It's at the corner of 5th and Rich Street.
Right downtown.
Right downtown, mm-hmm. Right downtown. And so that was the first parish. And so the Catholics down here didn't want to go back up there because the roads were dirt in those days. Mm-hmm. If it rained, it was difficult to get up there. Yeah. They wanted something closer to home. And there were so many Catholics down here. It was unbelievable.
How old is Holy Cross? How far back does that go?
I'd have to look. I don't have that figure with me. I can get it. But it's probably middle 1800s, or no, it's probably about 1830, somewhere around there. 1830s, 40s, yeah.
Because this one, St. Mary's, was started in the early 1860s, right?
They started planning for it in about 1863. Mm-hmm. They decided they were going to put church down here, and so that started to plan it. And then, of course, eventually in 1865, they had purchased the land and built the Spec Center and started work on the church. And the church was finished in 1868.
Was there anything on that property before the church was there? I know of one house, the Henry Oldenhausen house, which
The old
sat there.
housing was there. I don't know that any others were there or not. That's a good question. The first thing they built, of course, was Spec Center. Then they built the church, and the old housing house was north of the church where the convent was eventually placed. And it was the high school first, of course, before it came the convent. And then, of course, the third building built was the rectory. Mm-hmm. And that was it.
So the old housing house, where the Berkeley Center is now, correct?
Was right where Berkeley Center is now, right? Yeah.
And that became the first high school, essentially.
It became part of the first high school, right? They had little huts in the back, but they took and remodeled and put a science wing on it, the front of it, and everything. Just changed the whole structure of it.
And then the convent. I've always been a little confused about how that came along. That was in the same building?
No, the convents were the sisters that came, because they came from the beginning, 1865. When they started the school at Spec Center, or soon after that, there was a couple of individuals who were teachers, were lay people. But the church bought houses on Mohawk. Now, see, I forgot they did build the high school, which is the home now. Mm-hmm. That was originally the elementary school. And that was built about 1919, I think, if I remember right. I'd have to go back and look at that, but I think about 1919. And then south of that, about 3 or 4 doors, they bought one house that wasn't big enough for the sisters, and then they bought another house and connected the two with a chapel, I think on the second floor or something. There's some pictures around of that, I think, that we've got down in the archives. And so that's where the sisters were.
Okay, in 2 houses facing Mohawk.
2 houses facing Mohawk, right. What happened was, first of all, though, the first place when they built the church, the priest moved out of Spec Center and moved up behind the altar in the back of the church on the second floor. They had a place up there for him to live. And then the sisters that were here, which were few, moved into the Spec Center. And then, of course, eventually they opened up about these other houses for them.
And then the rectory came along a few years after
the rectory came along a few years after that, right, yeah. And yeah, what year was the rectory built? I want to say 1870 something, but I'm not sure. And then there was a garage behind there. That was all a field. That's where they practiced football. And before the elementary school and everything too. Excuse me. There were a couple houses there where the elementary school is currently located too, that were bought and torn down and such. One time the parish really owned a lot of property there, on that whole block. And one time, excuse me, the third pastor, Father Berkeley, who was there 45 years, Monsignor Berkeley, had intended to build the high school there. But politically it didn't happen, and so he owned practically the whole block, not all of it, most of it, and such at that time. He didn't. The bishop did, of course. It's all the bishop's property, but that was the plan, and it didn't happen.
Do you know who that property had belonged to before it became Catholic property? I would assume it was one of the very, very first landowners.
I'm sure it was too, and I can't remember. I don't know whether I've seen that or have done that. A good person to talk to is Ed Quickert. He's born and raised out here. He knows a lot. Now, see, across the street where the Thomas's house is, that was a farmhouse. So there's farmland around there, and
it's hard to imagine it being farmland, but I keep hearing that, so it's got to be true.
Yeah, it was farmland, yeah.
And fences and cattle.
Fence and cattle and everything. Yeah, yeah, that was. There weren't. I don't think there were many houses. I haven't really gone back to look at those Sanborn maps and everything, but where they go back that far. But there apparently wasn't too much around there. But although the number of Catholics living down here were a large number and such.
Now, I've heard that primarily you had Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. We don't hear much about the Jewish population, and just recently I was told that perhaps most of them lived north of Livingston in the area that was later wiped out due to urban renewal and the construction of the freeway. Do you have any knowledge of that?
No, I don't at this point in time, and I haven't seen anything on that really and such. I know a lot of the German families were wiped out, of course, especially the ones who sausage and everything that they made and such.
And I never thought about that, but I guess a lot of them would have lived as close to North Market as they could.
As they could, right, yeah. And then I think probably a lot of the Lutherans lived right around that area because of the church, too.
Mm-hmm. Old Trinity.
Old Trinity there,
yeah.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting. There, a lot of the development south of here, if you go through the property records of Franklin County, you'll find that those were farmlands of names that we recognize here, you know, out today. Some of the families are still around and everything who owned that land originally and such. So, like Beck Street, there's a Beck contingency of, you know, area that was sort of a development.
There are Becks around today.
There were Becks. No, I don't know. No, I don't think there are any more Becks around today. Schumachers, of course. They were big farmers there. And
Francis Stewart is a name we hear from long, long ago, having much of the property that is Schiller Park today.
Right.
And
what's interesting is
McAllen.
Up here, where the developers are coming in now with a bunch of $400,000 units, is a vacant field now with an old farmhouse that's back to 1829, I think. But it was a Stewart's slaughterhouse on the land. And of course, there were a lot of those all over the village. You know, I couldn't believe that they were within blocks of each other. Matter of fact, when we first moved here, there was a beautiful brick barn right down here, a brick structure behind the house on the corner of Lathrop and Sycamore there. I think that, I can't remember the name, Sauer, I think was the name of the woman that lived there at the time, but it was a gorgeous building, and that was a slaughterhouse too. That's where they slaughtered a lot made a lot of sausage and such. And one day it just fell down, just collapsed.
Really?
Yeah,
It's a big brick building.
Yeah, big brick building, beautifully done though.
But you're right. From what I can tell, there were slaughterhouses everywhere. Of course, next door to where Schmidt's now, where Schmidthoff was, and,
right.
On Macon Alley, I believe there were one or two, and it surprises me that the neighborhood could have supported that many. But I suppose they sent their pork products farther north.
Well, yeah, I don't know. The slaughterhouse, I'm surprised too, because as I go back through the history of my family, they raised hogs over in a little area called Hog Run there in southern Licking County, and they used to drive their hogs to Hogopolis, which was Cincinnati.
Okay.
That was one time a name for Cincinnati, Hogopolis.
I love that.
And but everybody raced hogs, drove them down there to be slaughtered.
But only hogs. There was not much beef around here, as far as
I
I know.
never. You know, nobody seemed to talk about beef in
and
the
I guess
history.
that's a German thing. I don't know for sure.
Oh yeah, I think no doubt about it. German, yeah, very definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It's fascinating. Of course, now you still have the Falters, which were down here. You know, they have a place over here, the Thurns, been in that business for years. And
oh, that's right. We still have those.
Oh, yeah. And of course the Schmidts, you know. So you've got the Schmidts, the Thurns, and the Falters.
I don't know who does the meat processing for the Schmidts these days.
I don't know either, whether they've got a facility or whether I don't know. I've never talked to them. I've never talked to them about it. I'd be surprised if they don't have a facility, but maybe not.
Yeah. Well, what about St. Mary's today? What I haven't been in. Of course, I've seen some of the pictures online. Is it filled now with just trusses and?
All the furniture in there is gone except for what they call the prayer wall, which is the Ravidos. There's 3 statues of saints in there. And there are 2 German saints and then Mother Mary of God, who the church is dedicated to. That has been walled off to prevent any kind of damage to it. They built a big wall to cover it completely. Everything else was taken out of the church except for the organ. It was too expensive to remove the organ and then put it back in, so they built a room and sealed it because it's over 100 years old and it's worth quite a bit of money. We spent a lot of money modernizing it and updating it and such. We celebrated its 100th centennial in 2001, and so that's still there. But everything else is gone. It's now scaffolding and these hydraulic jacks, which are holding up the roof.
Mm-hmm. Is work being done in there now, or right now are you just preserving it to?
Well, we've stabilized. Mm-hmm. Phase 1 is finished and has been stabilized, and that was due to a loan from the diocese. They gave the parish loaned the parish $800,000 to stabilize it, and they had to do that in a hurry because our biggest worry was that the roof would come down if we had a bad heavy snow. That's one of the reasons. The next phase will not start until we have at least 50% of the money in the bank, essentially, and pledges to cover the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But like I said, we're still, at this point in time, trying to deal with how much it's going to really cost. Mm-hmm. The architects and engineers are going back and forth about what will last for 100 years. That's what their plan is, try to do it for 100 years now. And so it's such a unique structure. You know, it's a Gothic church, and it's of all the Gothic churches, very few of them have the span of a roof like that is without columns. You go in a Gothic church, then normally they have two side rows of columns to hold up the roof and such. And that was designed and built so that the walls would hold it up. And the walls would have held it up, we think, had if they had not been strapped for money, because somewhere before I joined the church in the 70s, early 70s, they were having roof problems and they had slate roof. So instead of taking the slate off, they put asphalt over the top of the slate.
Oh, it made it even heavier.
Yeah, it made it heavier, and it caused the walls to start moving outward, the weight of it and such, and crushing walls. And so we had to remove that, and I forget what year we removed that and went to a just single asphalt roof. Mm-hmm. But so that's one of the problems, one of the things that aggravated and where the church is now. The walls have moved so much that the trusses fell off the walls and fell down. And you can see it now, but we have pictures of where the weight on the walls in certain areas has extruded, causes extrusion of the mortar. Mm-hmm. It's actually squeezing it out.
Is that something that wasn't discovered until this most recent?
It wasn't obvious until then, right?
Right.
Yeah, it was obvious. It was what made it really obvious. We'd had structural engineers in there for years worrying about it, but we were always worried about up near the altar because we'd have cracks appearing on the walls up there. And is everything okay? Are we settling, or is it dangerous? Well, no problem. But nobody ever went back near the bell tower, and if they did, they wouldn't have seen anything anyhow, because they had so much insulation in there that they covered up the trusses where they were on the walls, so you couldn't see them until you took the down. So what happened, what really brought it to attention, was when Father had come back from a pilgrimage. He hadn't said Mass that day, so he was in there about 6 o'clock in the afternoon saying Mass by himself. And all of a sudden, this loud boom, and then the bells rang, and this place turned, smelled funny and everything, and a huge flash of light and such, and that's when the lightning hit. Must have been quite a bolt. And as he started to look around, he noticed that when he went back in the back, the walls had separated about 2 or 3 inches from the choir loft, because there's a separate structure. It's on steel poles in there. And so then it was very obvious, hey, we had a serious problem. And that's the church eventually took and sent some other people down. They looked at it closer, and they said they temporarily condemned it. They say temporarily, because if they had condemned it, it would have had to been turned down. Mm-hmm. So they temporarily condemned it and closed it to the public.
So there definitely was some damage done that day.
Oh, there's definitely some. It aggravated it, yeah, and it brought it to our attention. To me, it was a message. Hey, you've got something you better look at, Mm-hmm. The biggest and so that's the biggest damage, but most of the damage is, insurance doesn't cover it because a lot of damage is due to the age of the building and such. And then these other factors. The insurance did cover the telephones. Our telephones were knocked out, both in the office building and in the church. Our electric went out. Damaged the organ, they covered some of that. The sound system, our elevator went out. We lost all of our computer connections and everything. All our computers too, they all had to be replaced. Now insurance has covered that, but they won't cover anything as far as the building's concerned.
But that much damage was done to the electrical.
Oh yeah, the electric process. And part of the problem is, again, over the years, not having the money to do things, I don't want to say right, but do things that were expensive, but should have been done. But a lot of electrical wires for the sound system were running outside the church.
Oh.
And so I think we think that might have really ended up causing more problems than it would have otherwise. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at that cross is stainless steel. And we've got cables about 1.5 to 2 inches running from there to the ground. And then we've got arresters all along the roof, because we've had problems before with the sound systems going out with the lightning strikes, mm-hmm. but nothing like this. And so that's where we're at, mm-hmm. and we're hoping to. Father has great hope that we can take and open the church by Drum Village Lights next year.
Really?
Yeah, so December, first week in December next year. But so we're hoping to get the money as soon as possible now to start. Mm-hmm.